Start recording. All right, so that is recording, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull up the screen right now to share with you all. So give me one last second. As you can see, we got all the good things open. And you guys are, as I said just now, if you are here, you're here for part 3 of the Workshop Wednesday Ballot Breakdown series. So this is a series that we are doing leading up to the election. So we being the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. And myself being Isaiah Fenichel, our voting rights coordinator at the center. So just a little bit before we dive into the larger conversation, like I said, we're going to be talking about the different executive offices, the role of executive offices, and how that's playing a role in this year's election. So who the candidates are, all that good stuff, right? That being said, so for some of you, I know I'm seeing some familiar names. You might have heard some of this information before, but for the folks that haven't, we are just going to do a quick recap, just who the Center for Law and Social Justice is, a little bit about the work that we do. The Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College was founded in 1986 by a group of activists, attorneys, Black elected officials, and community organizers, really coming together with the mission of addressing increased police brutality and mass incarceration in New York's communities of African descent. So that was the initial goal, but we also do work dealing with voting rights, voter protection, census and redistricting justice, as well as general civic education. And basically, we seek to use the law to ensure that New Yorkers of African descent are able to secure the political power and resources necessary for our communities to thrive. So, right, like I said, we started in 1986 with this work. It's been 35 years, 36 years actually this year. And today, in addition to continuing to fight in the courts, we still do that work. We also do community organizing and advocacy surrounding police reform and end to racial violence, seeking voting rights and voter protection, census and redistricting justice, as well as access to quality education and equitable education as well, and the protection of cultural rights. All this is with a concrete goal in mind, right? We envision a civically educated and engaged Black electorate that consistently builds political power to marshal the representation and resources necessary for our communities to thrive. All of that is a long-winded way of us saying this organization, A, is for the people, by the people. This was created through protest, through organizing, and through dedicated community servants wanting to come together and make a difference on behalf of communities of African descent. And with that goal in mind, we work explicitly in communities of African descent. This is not to say we don't work with other people, that we're not inclusive of all, that we are an inclusive organization, but we are absolutely unapologetically Black. We work on behalf of communities of African descent. So the way we put it, if your people came over on here between 1619 through 1865 and you were on ships, then you are communities of African descent, as well as some other different verifiers. We are a Pan-African organization and identify with the entirety of the diaspora. And we want to make sure that we are doing our justice to reach everybody in that work. And in doing that, right, part of that work, we are in the Our Future, Our Vote voting rights and education campaign. So what this campaign is, it works from a philosophy, right, that the youth who live in our communities, youth of African descent, will be inheriting the political decisions made by our elected leaders for generations to come. They'll be in the community living the longest, and as a result, should be taking great leadership, really should be at the forefront of leadership in building out the future we want to see. So not only coming out to vote, but running for office, starting organizations, and really taking an active role in our futures rather than waiting for the torch to be passed to us. So just some of the immediate goals of the campaign that we are seeking to achieve. We want to increase civic knowledge and participation among Black youth. And oh, I'm so sorry, y'all. Give me 1 second. I am having some technical difficulties. Let me just fix this up really quick. Hold on. Sorry about that, everybody. Minor technical difficulties. Work from home, you got to deal with the Wi-Fi and all the good stuff that comes with it. But that being said, just touching on the campaign to wrap it up. So we want to increase civic knowledge and participation among youth of African descent, and we want to create the infrastructure for long-term political empowerment within Black and Brown communities. So like I said, building the foundation now so that, yeah, we come out and vote, we make our voices heard, but that for years to come, we're organizing with a set game plan in mind for the change that we want to see and the future that we want to build. And we also work with other organizations, everybody, to amplify that collective effort, right? So that's the work that we do at the Center for Law and Social Justice. But without taking up too much time of the night talking about that, let's get into some of the meat of our conversation. So for some of you, you were in the past workshops. For others, you weren't. We're gonna do it. We're just gonna recap again, going through, so you guys can understand the different systems. So like, we at the Center for Law and Social Justice, we are dedicated to not having an ordinary, regular get out to vote campaign where we're just telling people to vote. Voting is great, voting is important, voting is necessary, but voting only works if you understand how this system works. So our conversation, it's basically a 4-pronged conversation. We start right all the way on the outside. We talk about the system that basically creates our government, that our government functions within. So that's where we're going to start first with these 2 terms. After that, we're going to talk about the roles, then the candidates, and then we'll get into the voting. But starting with this, and I'm seeing, obviously, there's some familiar names in the chat right now. But if anybody is familiar with any of these terms, so actually starting with separation of powers, does anybody want to just quickly type in the chat just to say what they think separation of powers are, what it means, just to kind of jumpstart the conversation? And give you guys a couple seconds to do that. It's just real quick. Just want to see where your guys' heads are at. So again, forewarning, a lot of our conversations. So 2 things. I can get very passionate surrounding issues and talking about these things. Do my best. We're a nonpartisan organization, so I'll do my best to keep any non-factual takes out of this conversation. So that's A. And then B, these conversations could be very boring if people aren't interacting. So if you guys have questions, comments, concerns, feel free, throw them in the chat at any time and jump in. But to kind of keep the night rolling along, again, we don't want to keep everybody too long. I know my favorite baseball team is in the playoffs, so I definitely want to get through the conversation. But to amplify, so yes, what Naima is mentioning in the chat, I believe it has to do with the legislative, executive, and judicial powers in government. Exactly, that is perfect. The separation of powers is this idea, for everybody who remembers being back in elementary school, or maybe you didn't learn it, but for everybody who is seeking to understand American government, right? American democracy, we have the separation of powers, which is the separate branches of the government. So the first branch is the legislative branch, right? That's like who writes the laws, who writes and passes and votes on the laws. The next branch is the executive branch. The executive branch is charged with enforcing the laws. So making sure that whatever laws we're passing in the legislative house are now signed in, and that our government has the ability to make these laws function in society, right? And then the final one is the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is left to interpret the laws to make sure that they're constitutional, that what's written on paper is actually what we mean in the law, right? So those are the three separate branches of government. So that's one of the ways that we separate government. And yet to also to amplify what Diane said, creating checks and balances, so no one branch is responsible for all the decision making. When the United States was founded, right, we had the Revolutionary War, a bunch of people dressed up in Native American suits and threw a bunch of tea into the ocean, had themselves a little riot, started a war, all of that, right? We made a country. We said we do not want to have a king in this country, because we did not want to be in the same situation where all the power was concentrated. So that's why we separated it into the three branches. The next separation, though, right? So we have the three branches of government, and that's at every level of government. But that's another division, right? We have different levels of government. And that's this concept of federalism. So rather than kind of try to give you a roundabout way of explaining it, I'm going to go ahead and pull this video up, just so I can share it with you guys. It'll be a quick explainer, about 4 or 5 minutes, just to explain this concept of federalism. So give me just 1 second. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Also, as I said, if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns at any point, feel free, type it in the chat, stop me, raise your hand, whatever it is, get my attention so that I can make sure we are answering all of the information that you guys have, all the questions that you guys have. So let me pull this up. Sorry about that. All right, here we go. And if everybody could just throw a quick thumbs up in the chat to confirm you guys are hearing it.
Lanes, speed limits, stop signs, or traffic lights. The roads would be chaotic, and you probably wouldn't feel safe. In its basic form, government is people coming together to organize a set of rules that we
can everyone just throw a quick something in the chat to confirm that you're hearing the sound?
The framers of the U.S. Constitution sought to create a system that divided power between the government of the U.S. and the government. And build highways. And the layers don't stop there. Government powers extend to cities and counties within a state. In Georgia, there are 159 counties and over 530 cities, also known as municipalities, within these counties. Counties serve several purposes, such as providing courts of law, holding elections, building and repairing county roads, and providing services like police and fire protection, libraries, schools, and public transportation. Within those counties are cities, which vary in power. Generally, a city holds the power to maintain law enforcement, collect taxes, and provide water and trash services. These local forms of government are important because they have a more direct interest in what's going on in their immediate community. If you've been counting, that's a total of 4 territorial divisions of government. So, how do they apply to the citizens of the United States? Imagine the tiered levels of government as a Russian nesting doll, with you in the center as the smallest doll. The second smallest doll is city government, and all the laws in that city apply to you. The county level government falls over the city government and you. All the laws and regulations set forth by the county apply to the city and to you. But the city laws don't necessarily apply to the entire county because there can be multiple cities within a county. The state government doll covers all of the counties, cities, and people in the state. A law passed at a state level cannot be overridden by a local government. Finally, you have the largest all, the federal government. The federal government reigns supreme, literally. Article 6, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution is the Supremacy Clause, which establishes that federal laws are the supreme law of the land. This means that national laws take priority over any conflicting state laws. Say, for example, Georgia wanted to pass a law making the voting age 21 years and older. This would be unconstitutional because it violates the 26th Amendment that states all citizens in the United States who are 18 years or older cannot be denied the right to vote based on their age. Although the federal government may pass laws that apply to all states, cities, and people, its power is limited by the U.S. Constitution. In fact, the 10th Amendment, the last entry in the Bill of Rights, was created in order to restrict the range of power exercised by the federal government. The 10th Amendment states that any power not listed in the U.S. Constitution is reserved for the states or the people. Another way to illustrate these divisions of power is to think about it in this way. Classroom rules may differ from one teacher to another. One teacher may allow free seating, while another provides assigned seating. But the school rules, like dress codes and bell schedules, apply to all classrooms. And the school district's code of conduct applies to all students in every school in the district. That means pulling the fire alarm or intentionally blocking school traffic are offenses in any classroom in any school in the district. Just like government, these rules are intended to keep people safe. Now that you know how the United States separates governments responsible for lawmaking, can you think of any other examples of division of power?
So that video, sorry about the sound. I didn't realize when I muted myself, it was going to cut off the sound for you guys. So I apologize for that. So if there's any questions about that little portion that was missed, please feel free, type it in the chat, let it be known. But that is the concept of federalism in that video, right? And I think probably the best example, she gave the two examples on there, right? The Russian nesting dolls and the classroom rules, right? And how that breakdown goes. So when you think of federalism, when you think of our government, it's shells, it's different, it works its way in, and each element has a different level of power that it's going to deal with. And then you have the three different branches at each level that are responsible for hearing, deciding, legislating, enforcing different things. So if there's any questions about that, or we got to come back and circle back, please feel free, throw it in the chat. But just to keep the night moving and moving along, we're going to talk specifically today about the New York State executive branch. So, right, in this conversation, right, that's the larger system, separation of powers and federalism. When we're talking about that, this conversation, we're going to talk about the New York State executive branch. So on the state level, the people who are charged with enforcing the laws of our government. And as we go along, feel free, throw any, I just want to hear also what information you guys have coming in, if any of it's new, if any of it's old. So if you know anything about the executive branch, feel free, throw it in the chat. But while you guys do that, I'm going to go ahead and give an explainer as well. So right, the New York State executive branch is in charge of running all the various governmental activities through a series of departments. All of these departments make up the executive branch totally. So it's not just the one person, there's several different agencies. So three of the departments themselves, right? It's made up of different departments. Three of the departments are headed by elected officials. So people who we vote into office that make decisions. Those three elected officials are the governor, the comptroller, and the attorney general. Just a heads up for tonight's conversation, we are going to leave the Attorney General's office separate from the executive branch, even though they're a part of the executive branch, and that is where their seat fits in within the separation of powers in the government, right? We're going to talk about them later on in our final ballot breakdown when we talk about the judicial system, just because it's a little bit tricky dealing with the Attorney General because they deal with the courts, right? That being said, so the three departments that are headed by elected officials, the rest of the departments each are headed up by people who are appointed, generally by the governor, and with the consent of the Senate. So the governor appoints somebody, and then the Senate would go and approve. But again, I'll talk about that more a little bit more when we get to talking about the governor. The only exception to that rule with the appointments is the Commissioner of Education, but we're not even going to go into all of that granular level detail. So yeah, that's this right here. But really, ultimately, what you need to know about the executive branch is that it's characterized by a strong governor with certain powers over the appointment and the budget. So really at the center of all of this is the governor. So and that's why when you hear the executive branch, usually you are thinking of the top position, the top figurehead, right? The top executive. So you're thinking of the president, you're thinking of governors, the mayors, whoever is that head person. But this is just that one branch. And the biggest part of that branch is their power over appointing other people to lead agencies. And that's their executive authority. So their authority to appoint people, make executive decisions, all of that is checked by the power of independently appointed people. So like how I mentioned, the Commissioner of Education is someone separate. The governor has no control over that entity. Also, things elected officials. So because the state Senate has to write the laws and confirm the laws, even though the governor can do certain things, they can't act without the consent of the rest of the government. Not in most cases. So that is in a nutshell the executive branch, right? If there's any questions about this, again, just throw it in the chat. We're going to keep it moving today. I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time. But this is, in a nutshell, what the executive branch is. So, right, following along our four-pronged conversation, we talked about the system, that's the separation of powers, federalism, all of that. Now we're talking about the branch. This is another part of the system, but it's a specific role in the system. So now that we're going to get a little bit more specific, right? So we have the executive branch. In the executive branch, there are four different positions in the executive branch. Remember, Attorney General included, four different positions that we're voting on in this year's election. The first of which is the governor. So we're going to start our conversation here and kind of break down what exactly the role of the governor's office is, what the governor does. Starting at the top, right, they're the chief executive. They're the head person in charge, and they serve a 4-year term. So this is common in all executive branch positions. The lead executive, the top executives serve a 4-year term. So again, president, governor, the mayor, all of these things serve a 4-year term, and the governor specifically. So in that role, right, for the 4 years that you're the governor, that you're the chief executive, you're charged, you get to sign and veto legislation. So they vote on it in the House, or excuse me, not the House, in the legislative body. So the New York State legislature, the bills pass, then it comes to your desk and you either sign or veto it. Vetoing it means even if the law passed, you could say, I'm not signing it. And then they have to go back and vote and have enough strength to override your veto. We'll probably talk more about that next week, but for context, like that's one of the major powers of the governor, is to sign and veto legislation. Next is to also set the state's annual budget. So the governor has the final say on the budget. They take input from both the House, or excuse me, not both the House, the both houses of the state legislature. So the state Senate and Assembly, they take input from that, they take consideration, but ultimately the governor is who determines the budget, who sets the state's annual budget. And then they also get to appoint the leaders of state agencies. So when we're saying state agencies, just to be clear, there's 96 different statewide agencies in New York. So 96 across New York State, most of which are, I believe 95 of which are appointed by the governor, the people who run these agencies. So that's places like the Department of Health, the Department of Children and Family Services, transportation, labor, motor vehicles, the Board of Elections, mental health, all of these things are different state agencies that the governor is appointing people to run them. And so obviously, right, there's so many different services you could name and pick out of the ones that even I just said. But this is how your vote goes from you vote for the governor, and then it determines who is going to be appointed into these roles. And then these appointments have to be confirmed later on. The final thing that the governor has the power to do is to grant pardons and commutations for state offenses. So what this means, these are forms of clemency. So this is a criminal justice kind of term. The governor has the ability. So when we say a commutation, this is to reduce the length of someone's sentence. Say you were serving life in prison. The governor has the power to say, well, we're not going to say you have to serve life in prison. We're going to take that down and make it only 10 years instead, make it 1 year, whatever. The governor could even go as far as a full pardon and pardon you for your crimes. So not only would your sentence end, but you would be basically scot-free. You would be cleared away of any past criminal conviction, either some of it or all of it at once. This is obviously like clemency. This idea is an extraordinary form of relief. This is not something that happens a lot. It is not very common. Right, there's thousands and thousands of people that are currently incarcerated in New York State. It would be a lot if a few hundred of them received gubernatorial pardons or commutations. It would be a lot. So to put that context, but these are the powers that the governor has in being the chief executive. Before I go further, are there any questions, comments, concerns about the role of the governor? Feel free, you could raise your hand, throw it in the chat, either or. And I'm seeing a hand up, so we're gonna pass this over to Nancy. We're gonna allow you to talk. Nancy, I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my hand. I'm sorry, Isaiah. Sorry,
all,
sir.
all good, all good, all good, all good. Don't worry about it.
Sorry.
Nah, don't worry about it. Thank you so much. All right. Sorry about that. Let me just figure out how to lower your hand. There we go. So yeah, if anybody has any other questions, you can raise your hand, do anything, we'll throw it up. We can get to it, all right? But moving along, continuing with the conversation, the lieutenant governor. So, right, so we have the governor, then we have the lieutenant governor. This is also an elected position. This is like I said, there's 4 different positions. The second is the lieutenant governor. So the lieutenant governor is the second highest ranking executive, right behind the governor. And they also serve a 4-year term. To put it in the same context, right, as like the president, the federal executive branch, for the president, there's a vice president, right? And the vice president really doesn't have a lot of major roles, but they do. So let me give you kind of an explanation of what it means to be the lieutenant governor in New York State. So the first thing that the lieutenant governor is responsible for is presiding over the state senate. So what that means is essentially they're the ones that are dictating the proceedings in the state senate. So they're banging the gavel, they're making the decisions. And in the instance that there is a tie in the state legislature, for whatever reason in the state senate, if the Senate comes down to a split decision, if it's a 50-50 vote, right? I'm blanking on the exact number for it to be half right now. So we're going to say 50-50, right? And it's split halfway. The lieutenant governor gets to cast the deciding ballot in those instances. They get to decide whatever they think, if it's yes, if it's yay, if it's nay, if it's yes, if it's no. The lieutenant governor gets to make that decision and break the tie. So that's one of their big powers as presiding officer over the state Senate. The next responsibility, the next important thing that they are charged with doing is they become the governor if the sitting governor leaves office before the end of their term. The best example of this is our current governor right now in New York State, right? Governor Kathy Hochul was originally elected as the lieutenant governor for the former governor Andrew Cuomo. Obviously, right, we don't need to go back into the whole mess of what happened with Andrew Cuomo's situation, but due to a number of allegations, he wound up resigning from office. When he resigned from office, he still had the rest of the year in his term. So, right, that happened earlier this year. He had the rest of the year to fill out his term. So, actually, I believe it was last November, I want to say around this time last November, he stepped down out of office, and Governor Hochul, then Lieutenant Governor, was moved up into the governor's seat. And so now she became the first female governor of New York State as a result of this. But that's the process of lieutenant governor becoming governor. So again, I mean, it's really self-explanatory, not to kind of deteriorate from the work that the lieutenant governor does and like what they mean to the community and the government apparatus, but there's not really much that they could do. So if you have any questions about the lieutenant governor or any comments, concerns, anything, again, throw that in the chat. But we're going to keep moving right along, right? So feel free anytime, we can circle back for all of it. The last role that we're going to talk about for tonight's conversation, as I said, we're going to leave out the Attorney General for this conversation. And instead, we're going to talk about the Comptroller. So the Comptroller, what do you all know about the Comptroller's office, the role of Comptroller? Feel free to throw anything you do know into the chat. If it's nothing, if it's nothing, it's nothing. If it's something, it's something. It doesn't matter. But I just want to kind of see what you guys know about this office in particular. So I'll give you a second or two to type some responses in there. So, and for context, the reason why I'm asking about this office specifically, is because even as someone who I consider myself a student of politics, we generally don't hear much about a comptroller's office, about the role of comptroller. But as it turns out, they are truly one of the most important entities in the government. So exactly, we're seeing it roll in the chat right now. Yeah, that's the person who deals with the financial aspect, manages state budgets, finances, etc., tax collector, treasurer, yep, absolutely. So see, all of this is right. So jumping into the presentation, right? The comptroller is the New York's chief financial officer. So for this office, there's no real equivalent at the federal level. There isn't a one person that's elected and controls federal money, right? That's not a thing. On the state level, however, the comptroller is vitally important. So they're the chief financial officer, and they also serve a 4-year term. As you're seeing, right, the executive office, generally executive offices serve 4-year terms. So the first thing the comptroller is responsible for is that they ensure that New York State's local governments, state and local government, collects and uses taxpayer money effectively and efficiently to promote the common good. So right, in New York State, the first thing is they had the statewide payroll. So all the people who work for the state government, who have government jobs, work for all of these different agencies and all of these entities, right? That's a payroll of about $16.7 billion a year. The comptroller is in charge of overseeing that account and making sure everybody gets paid on time. So if you have a government job, your check is signed by the comptroller's office, along with everybody else. And they're also the sole trustee for the $258 billion New York State retirement fund. So for state employees, the retirement fund, that pension that you get after you retire, the $258 billion retirement fund, that is also determined by the comptroller's office. And as well as administering the retirement, administering these funds to the over 3,000 employers, the 1 million retirees that live in New York, as well as their beneficiaries. This comptroller controls all of that, and that's just the first aspect of their job. The next aspect, they also administer the state's requirement system for public employees. So what this means is the requirement in order to work for state government, the tests, all of those things are directed through the comptroller's office. So the person that's elected to do this is in charge of managing and overseeing all of those things as well. And then the final aspect is they review New York State contracts and audit payments. What this means, so right, if you're a financial head, you kind of know if you do taxes, if you do all these things, when they talk about audits, it's to make sure that the money you said you spent, the money that was out was spent correctly. And there was nothing, it was spent correctly and it was spent effectively. So what the comptroller's office does, they do audits over local and state officials to find and improve program performances, right? If we say we're gonna give $1 million to building new street lights, right? If we say that's the goal, we're building new street lights, $1 million for that. If a year later, 2 years later, we come back around saying we need another $1 million, we're going to have to understand what happened to the last $1 million. Are there street lights? Are they visible? Is it better lit, right? So all of those things, that's the comptroller coming back to make sure the money that was spent adequately and in the best way possible, right? Because again, that's the first goal, is to use taxpayer money effectively and efficiently to promote the common good. So that's the role of the comptroller. They, like you all said, they handle the money. But even bigger than handling the money, they really control the whole system. And if you know, right, the whole world runs on our financial capacity, on economics, on this. So the comptroller's office is very important for that. If there's any comments, questions, again, about the comptroller or any of the two previous offices, governor, lieutenant governor, feel free to throw them in the chat. But this is exact. So this is the role of the comptroller. So we're going to move forward with the next part of our conversation, right? So again, just to pause and reiterate, we have this conversation, we like to view government, and how government should be viewed really is as an organization, and at the top of that organization is the people. The people are what makes this whole thing run. We're the ones that control it. We're the ones that pick the people. We're the bosses, the CEOs, whatever. It's the people, right? But in order to have an effective company, you have to know what exactly you're trying to achieve, how you're going to achieve that. So that's the system, right? Next, you got to know who needs to do what to make these goals a reality. That's the different roles. That's like deciding how to break up the government through federalism, through the 3 separate branches, through understanding what each different role is. And then finally, right, once you know what the jobs are, what the goal is, now it's time to start picking who the candidates are, who you want to hire, right? So that's why in this conversation, even though it's a ballot breakdown, we talk about who the candidates are and the voting things last, because none of this matters unless we are really looking into none of this matters unless we're looking into the systems behind it, right? Unless we're understanding how to make our votes effective. So that being said, right, Who's on the ballot for governor? We're going to start there right at the top, the chief executive. So this year, right, we had primary elections back in June, and we had the Democratic and Republican primaries for governor. Like I had mentioned before, Governor Hochul was appointed to the governorship after Andrew Cuomo stepped down. She is running for re-election and did compete in the primary election. She had two other opponents, Jumaane Williams and Thomas Swazi. She was able to pull out the election and win the nomination of the Democratic Party. If you know, I got to do the talking point about this primary election. So this is a statewide election in which New York State has almost 6.5 million registered Democratic voters who were eligible to vote in the New York State primary. In June, on June 28th, only 863,000 people came out and voted for the governor. So that was roughly 13%, 13% turnout for eligible voters. Governor Hochul got just under 600,000 votes, so like 68% of the vote. And so she became the nominee and won that election. A lot of people didn't vote. And as a result, this is our choice, our nominee for the Democratic Party. On the other side, in the Republican Party, there was also a primary election. And in that election, there was 4 different candidates. The winner of it was Representative Lee Zeldin, who is a congressman out of Long Island right now. He's the nominee. He won the nomination for the Republican Party. And to even highlight in this election, right, there's almost 3 million registered Republicans in New York State. Across all of New York State, only 445,000 came out to vote in this primary, where there were 4 different choices. So Lee Zeldin competed against Andrew Giuliani, Rob Astorino, and Harry Wilson, and was able to get about 44% of the vote, so like 200,000 votes. And so that's how he was able to secure the nomination. Now on election day, the only 2 names that will be appearing on the ballot are Governor Kathy Hochul and Representative Lee Zeldin for the Republican Party, and Governor Kathy Hochul for the Democratic Party. So those names, so there were third-party candidates, but they either did not qualify to make the ballot, i.e. they didn't have enough signatures, enough people basically to qualify, or they simply withdrew from the race. And so these are the 2 choices that we have for governor on election day. That being said, if you have questions about this race specifically, you could throw that in the chat for sure. But yeah, these are our 2 candidates for New York State governor in this year's election. Also, what I'm going to do is drop links to both of their campaign websites in the group chat. And so that way you all can go and do some research on these candidates on your own. So we're going to do this for all the candidates we talk about tonight. This way you guys can go do the research, find the information you need about who's seeking to represent us, right? So yeah, this is the office of governor. These are the 2 candidates. Moving forward, right? Lieutenant governor. So the thing with governor and lieutenant governor, it tends to become a joint ticket after the primaries, right? And when I say a joint ticket, that means that the Democratic nominees run together as the Democratic nominees for governor and lieutenant governor. The Republican nominees run together as governor and lieutenant governor candidates for the Republican Party. Same thing for the working families and conservative parties all through. Generally, it becomes a joint ticket, so they're running together. So when you vote for one, you're voting for the other. That being said, it's important to know who our nominees are. So our nominee is Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado. So he's actually running for re-election. He also, because of the former lieutenant governor, Brian Benjamin, because of a situation that he was forced to resign as well. And when he resigned, Governor Hochul then appointed Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado to his current position. So he's running for re-election and was able to get a primary victory in June. He won in that election. So again, just to highlight, of the same almost 6.5 million, only 820,000 people, about 40,000 people less voted for lieutenant governor in this race, and there were 3 candidates running. Antonio Delgado wound up winning this election with 61% of the vote. So he's the Democratic nominee. On the other side, in the Republican Party, there was not a primary. There were no challengers. So their nominee was the single person who did run, Allison Esposito, who is serving as the Republican nominee for this election. So I'm going to drop links to both of their campaign websites in the chat. And just to note, as I said, it's usually joint tickets. So these 2 campaign websites are also branched off of the candidate for governor's websites. But under the meet so-and-so section, meet their lieutenant governor. So you guys can do the research there and get to know these candidates as well. So when you're voting on election day, you have all the information you need. Finally is comptroller. So this is the money guy. This is the one we don't talk about enough, but holds a lot of power. So who is on the ballot for comptroller? So currently our current comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, did not face any challengers in the primary. So there wasn't a primary election. He's running for re-election, and was able to secure the nomination, right? Nobody ran against him. So he's the guy for the Democratic Party. On the other end, nobody ran against the Republican, Paul Rodriguez. So he's the Republican nominee on that side. So these are the 2 candidates for the Republican and Democratic parties running for New York State Comptroller. And again, we're going to drop all those resources into the chat for you guys to go over. That being said, so like I said, we're gonna talk about the Attorney General's office in a few weeks, just a little bit later, but in the context of the judicial system, even though they're part of the executive branch. So for tonight's discussion, these are the 3 offices we're talking about. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns about the nominees, the primaries, who they are, feel free, raise your hand, ask in the chat. And I can address them. But yeah, these are the candidates. You guys have the links. You guys have the ability to do the research. So all that is left is this important part, right, of actually voting and getting out to vote. So yeah, just again, if you have any questions and comments, throw them in there. But while you guys do that, while you type out anything that you may want to say or any questions you may have, I'm going to continue along with the presentation. So moving forward, right? We know the candidates, we know the system, we know what jobs we're expecting them to do, right? We know all these things. Now's the important part of actually making our voices heard so that these candidates know that they have a job to do, and that job is to work on behalf of us, right? And the first step to doing that is registering to vote. So that's the process, right? You check in with the Board of Registration, the Board of Elections, you give them all your information, your address, and they tell you you're eligible to vote, you're good to go, and then you go and vote on election day. So just some standards so you guys know what the standards are to vote. You must be a citizen in the United States, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. You could be living in any of those places, but you must live in New York to be registered as a voter in New York. You must also be at least 18 years old on or before election day, but if you're 16 or 17, you can pre-register to vote for when you turn 18. So what that means, so right, if unfortunately, actually, and this I skipped over this. So in order to register to vote for this year's general election, you would have had to register by last Friday, October 14th. Unfortunately, that date has passed. So if you aren't registered to vote in this year's election, that deadline has passed. It doesn't mean you can't register to vote, because there will be elections next year and every year after that through 2028. And if you are 16 or 17, you could pre-register for when you turn 18, so that you, once, if there's an election that year, which there will be, if there's an election, you can go and vote. You don't got to worry about filling out the paperwork after you turned 18. Right when you turn 18, you're good to go. Um, and the final thing to note is incarceration status, right? So as of May 2020, all New Yorkers who are not in prison for a felony currently, if you are not currently in prison for a felony, you are eligible to vote, including if you are on parole or probation. For a long time, New York restricted the right to vote of those who are incarcerated. In recent years past, we've been able to open that up more and more to allow people to have the right to vote, regardless of conviction status. Currently, if you are still incarcerated, if you are incarcerated under a felony and you are serving time in prison, unfortunately, you are unable to vote still. That being said, if you want to register to vote, if you have a New York State ID, I'm going to go ahead and throw this link in the chat. So even if you're not registered to vote right now for this year's election and you missed the deadline, that's okay. You get registered to vote next year. If you don't have an ID, you can go to democracy.nyc. I'm going to throw this right here, to request a ballot be sent to your house from the Board of Elections. Or you can call the Board of Elections directly or email them with the name of your borough in order, and they'll send you a voter registration form to get your name on the list, right? Or you could go in person as well. That's an option too. But all of these things, right? This is how you get registered to vote. Once you're registered to vote, there's a few different ways you can make your voice heard through voting, right? The first is this idea of vote by mail. Vote by mail, this is absentee voting. So you would visit nysabsentee.com to request an absentee ballot, and then you got to send it back by the day before election day. So it has to be postmarked by November 7th. And I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the chat as well. So yeah, I'm just going to reiterate that right here. So in order to request a ballot, so this is not your ballot. In order to request a ballot, so to have Board of Elections send one to your house for you to fill out and send back before election day, you have to request that ballot by Monday, October 24th. So that's the Monday that's coming up. Today's the 19th. So you guys have about 4 days really after today to request your ballot via the Board of Elections. After you requested it and received it, you have until Monday, November 7th to complete your ballot and to send it back in. If you aren't going to vote absentee ballot, if you're not voting by mail, but you know who you're going to vote for, you're voter ready already, and you're ready to go, or you can't make it on election day or whatever reason you may have, New York allows early voting starting October 29th all the way through Sunday, November 6th. So anytime in that period, you're allowed to go out, find your poll site. I'm going to drop the link to find your poll site in the chat right now as well. And this is also the same link that you can use to find your poll site on election day. But you would go To that Find My Poll site, .vote.nyc, you can view your early voting days and poll site locations, as well as times that the polls are open, and cast your ballot before election day at your convenience, right? And then the final day to vote, the last opportunity you have, is what we call election day, right? That's the last chance you have. After November 8th, that's Tuesday, November 8th. After that day, you can no longer cast a ballot in this year's election. So again, that's the same website. You're going to go to that Find My Poll site, .vote.nyc, to view your polling location and to find that information. And then on election day, all you do, you get everything you need together, have your voter plan ready, and you go to the polls, and you do not leave unless you cast your ballot in this election. Regardless of what's said, what's done, if they tell you for some reason they don't have you on the polls, ask for an affidavit ballot so that your voice is heard and that you are counted in this election. So these are all the ways to vote. That's how you register. If you have any questions, anything about that, throw that in the chat so we can definitely get you squared away. These deadlines are rolling through right now, so it's definitely go time. To answer Waukesha's question, is there a video archive of previous sessions, specifically the ballot proposal session? Absolutely. So we are working on getting the two previous sessions that we had loaded onto the clsj.org website. They should be up there. We're trying to have them up by the end of this week, so you guys can all go back through and look at the different images and all of the things, so you can get in touch with all this information, right? Also, another way that you can get that, I'm going to give more resources later. We have our Center for Law and Social Justice voter guide, as well as a few other resources and information. But in terms of finding the recordings of the last session, we're looking to load those up by the end of the week this week, so you guys can review that. That being said, and feel free, keep adding to the chat, throw in any questions you have, anything at all, of course. And no, it's no problem at all. Actually, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this now before I forget. I'm going to throw my email address into the group chat. If anybody has anything they want to reach out to on the side, any questions you want to ask, something that you think of after today, feel free to shoot me an email and we can definitely talk, and I could do whatever I can to help out. Last but not least, right? So you know how to register, you know who the candidates are, you know the roles, you know what everything's supposed to look like. Now, finally, how do you fill out the ballot? So I'm going to do a quick presentation real quick, just a quick demonstration of how to fill out your ballot on election day. Sorry about that. And this will hopefully this helps you guys out with just understanding what it looks like. So this is a sample ballot using the Center for Law and Social Justice's address. So while the candidates may change, the structure isn't going to change based on where you're living. So this will be what the top of your ballot looks like. Let me actually zoom out. So this is kind of a really far out, it's hard to read, so I'm gonna keep it as visible as I can. In this top section, right, you see it says instructions. They have it first in English, then in Spanish. Depending on your poll site, they definitely will have different translations. So if there's a language impairment, you still have the right to vote. That you cannot be denied the right to vote based on language. So absolutely ask a poll worker, somebody to help you get a translation. But these instructions are up here. Underneath that, you're going to start seeing the list of candidates and the offices. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to kind of clear it up and break it down, right? On this left-hand side, right, you see this column, it lists out the offices that are on the ballot. So for the first column, it says the governor and lieutenant governor. The row underneath that is for the comptroller, then attorney general, then senator, representative, so on and so forth for each office that is on the ballot. And in each of these boxes, again, it says the office in English, and then underneath it, it gives the office listed in Spanish. And if need be, you can ask a poll site worker for other translations so that you can read your ballot and understand it. To the right of that column, right, in order, you have the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, the Working Family Party. If there were other parties, they would be filled into these two gaps. So down here, you see like LaRouche. It doesn't really apply to tonight's conversation, but that's just the structure. And then this last column is the write-in column. And that's where if you don't want to vote for any of these candidates, you can write in anybody who you want and give them your vote. You just circle in that little bubble. So when you're filling out your ballot, you're going to go through each candidate and you're going to circle whichever bubble it is that you want to vote for. One thing to highlight, right? You can only vote one time in each line. So even though you see in the Democratic Party and Working Families Party, it's both parties have Kathy Hochul and Antonio Delgado running on their ticket. In the Republican and Conservative Party, Lee Zeldin and Allison Esposito, both running on the same ticket in both parties. Even though it is the same people running in the race, you cannot fill out a vote for multiple parties. If you do that, your whole vote would be thrown away. It wouldn't be counted. So whoever you plan to vote for on election day, pick the party under which you want to vote for. So whether it's going to be the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Working Families Party, what have you, you're going to pick the party you want to select, and then you're going to fill the bubble in corresponding to that party, right? And you're going to go through and do that, and you're going to see across, it happens in almost every election, that the same candidate names are featured under multiple parties. Just remember, you can only vote for them once in each slot, right? Or in each office. You can only cast one vote for each office. So after you do that, after you run through all of the candidates, all the positions, you're going to flip your ballot over, of course, because this year we have 4 ballot proposals in New York State that we can vote on. If you're in New York City, there's 3 that are specific, or excuse me, there's 1 statewide ballot initiative, and then there's 3 that are specific to New York City. So in New York City, you have a chance to vote for 4. So after you filled out the candidates on the front part, you're going to flip it over, and on the back part is the ballot initiatives, and these are all yes or no votes. Again, you're going to go back and look at our video and presentation discussing the ballot proposals if you're looking for more information on that. But that's how you're going to fill it out, and then you're going to circle yes or no in that box as well. That being said, I'm going to click back over. Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns with regard to filling out your ballot? Feel free to type it in the chat if you have any. Hopefully, though, hopefully that helped, and if you have any questions, I can definitely answer. But some other resources that can help you out, we have a few different things we're doing to help make sure you're voter ready. So right, the first thing is our 10-page voter guide. This has all the information you need to vote successfully and effectively in this year's general election. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to that in the chat as well. I'm going to drop all the resources in a second. Actually, I'm going to drop them all right now and tell you them as we go along. So the first resource is our voter guide. That's to help you make your voice heard through voting, right? The next thing is our community survey. So again, we are not the regular Get Out to Vote campaign. It is more important to us that the issues and needs of the community are being addressed than simply that the community is voting. Because you can vote till you're blue in the face, but if your needs are not met, then voting is not being used effectively for you. So part of that work is using this community survey so that community members can tell us what issues are important to them. So us as advocates can go and work on behalf of the community to make sure that we are helping to meet the needs, and to help amplify your voices and make your voices heard, to help speak truth to power, right? If you want to join us in that work, we also have our volunteer sign up sheet where you can sign up to come join the Center for Law and Social Justice in our outreach, whether it's phone banking in the field or any of the things. You could sign up to volunteer and get out and do the good work with us. Finally, we have our last 2 ballot breakdown workshops. So the next week, that there'll be the last 2 installments of Workshop Wednesday. So next Wednesday, October 26th, we'll be discussing the New York State Legislative Branch. And you can reserve tickets using the Eventbrite link in the chat. And then the following week on November 2nd, we'll be talking about the New York State judicial branch and justice system, and how your vote relates to that. So all of these things are really good resources. Feel free to check them out. Join up whenever you can. And yeah, we are going to try to get those previous presentations as well as tonight's presentation up onto the CLSJ website so that you all can view it. Once they are up, we're going to send emails also to everybody who's attended these events so you can go back, look it over, and review the information. That being said, is there any last questions, comments, concerns, anything at all from you lovely folks this evening? Feel free to throw it in the chat. Feel free to share any of these resources, all of these resources with your friends, with your families, with your neighbors. It is critical that we are using this and using this election to make our voices heard. Definitely need you all to do your part. It's important. That being said, thank you all so much for joining us. This concludes part 3 of the part 3 already. Part 3 of the Workshop Wednesday Breaking Down the Ballot series. It's been great. I love talking to you all, and thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your night.